what needs to happen really at the get-go is setting some very clear boundaries, clearly defining what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So if you're going to drink, you have time when you don't have the children to drink. However, and I understand it's a problem, and I understand you want to change it, and I pray that you will. However, my only concern is the children.
Right.
And so if we can make an agreement that when you're with the children, you will not drink, and you won't drink the night before because you know how you wake up with a hangover, or you're not going to drink while they're with you, then this is your life and this is your problem, and I hope you will deal with it.
I'm Rachel Green, divorce mediator and collaborative attorney. Join me as I chat about everything from smoothly navigating your way through divorce to prenups, all the while keeping the kids in mind. I'm Rachel Green, and welcome to Keep the Kids in Mind. This morning, we are very lucky to have a repeat visit by Dr. Randy Heller, who is a very experienced therapist, collaborative specialist, a licensed marriage and family therapist who's worked in Florida, New York, Connecticut. She's a Supreme Court family mediator, a parenting coordinator, a reunification specialist, and she has much wisdom and insight that can help families going through transitions. Randy, thank you so much for coming to Keep the Kids in Mind.
Good morning, Rachel. Thanks so much for having me.
There's so many directions we can go in this rich work that we do. But I have a case that's been troubling me lately, a collaborative case where one of the parents has struggled with addictions issues. And I'm wondering if we could talk about that, just because it's, it's so challenging. It's such a challenging issue on a personal level for anyone who has battled addiction to, many, many different things that people in our society today struggle with. There's the traditional drugs and alcohol, but there can be sex addiction, there can be internet addiction, there can be many kinds of addiction that could interfere with someone's ability to parent, which is what is my concern as a practitioner.
And I think as we discuss it, we really have to keep in mind the context, Rachel. So, as you name all of these different types of addiction, I think about maladaptive coping mechanisms. We are in a time in our society where stress is so high and distress is so high. And a lot of this has just been thrown on all of us. And so I think people are reaching for the closest thing to soothe themselves. And I think that if someone was on the cusp of an addiction, let's just say, or has what we might call an addictive personality, right now they're reaching because they don't know what else to do. Right. And I think in our work, we have so much opportunity to help these people. And then, of course, as the name of your podcast implies, help the children, because the children want to love their parents regardless of their challenges and want to be safe with their parents regardless of their challenges. And I believe the parents want that too. So in our process of collaboration, alternative dispute resolution, we really have the opportunity to provide a team of professionals to help this family in all the different dynamics and help them to manage. And I think that's the key. We have to help them to manage. And I believe there are certain things that we can do and certain steps we can take so that it doesn't interfere with their parenting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really wonderful to hear that there's ways that we can help intervene. And in the case I'm working on now, what's happened is that when the parent has relapsed in the past, he's just disappeared, cut off all communication with the mother. She pleaded with him during a meeting and said, "It can happen. I understand that you can relapse, but just don't disappear, because I just want to know what's going on." And a couple of times he picked the kids up and disappeared. He was intoxicated when he went to pick up the kids, and he at least showed up to pick up the kids. But then to this day, she doesn't know where he went.
Hmm.
during those 6 hours when he was supposed to come back with the kids and he didn't. And she just had no idea, were they alive? What had happened? So terrifying for the,
I'm
yeah.
sure. How scary. And that speaks to exactly the first thing that has to happen in any one of these processes is establishing clear communication between the parents, and though without shame, without an attack, without blame, because I think that when you tell me that he didn't respond, I'm guessing that he didn't respond, and I'm not suggesting an excuse, but perhaps an explanation, because he knew what was coming. And you know what I always say in these matters, always, and I'm not a person for absolutes, but I am in this. I always say we come into the middle of their movie.
Yes.
We don't know what happened before we got there. We really don't. We hear stories, but we really don't know what happened before we got there. And so we have to take into consideration that these dynamics were going on well before we entered the picture. And so there's probably a history of conflict around this, of course, and blaming and shaming and guilt and anger and everything else that we can imagine, whatever the addiction is, right? And so I often say to people, if you want someone to talk to you, you have to create the context where they're going to feel safe in doing that. Now, of course, in defense or deference to your client, if she's panicked and she's frightened and she's scared, she's not going to think about, oh, how can I communicate with him in a way that he's going to listen? However, I think we have to take the opportunity to teach these people new skills. When I come onto a matter, I always say, again, if they knew how to communicate well and brainstorm solutions and understand each other's perspective, they probably wouldn't be getting divorced. And so we have to start there and teach them how to talk about this. And I think that's really key. And really encourage discussions about feelings and concerns and needs while also being mindful of the triggering issues and the angst that comes with that, and also the lack of ability to do that. They don't know how to do that yet.
That's so interesting that you're framing it as a problem of communication style. And I could see that her partner would just be barraged by
You go.
by all of it, and then that would trigger him to just withdraw because he
Sure.
doesn't feel like there's a room for his voice in this conversation because she's dominating it.
And he knows that. You know that he knows that. It's kind of like the child who takes the cookie out of the cookie jar, and they know that they're going to get caught and they know they're going to get punished. However, they're hoping that they don't and they won't. However, they're fearful. So they're not acknowledging what they've done. And so, again, I'm not suggesting that this woman doesn't have a right to be angry and frustrated and fearful. And I think when people are fearful, they become more angry and more aggressive because they're trying to stop that behavior. However, what we know is that doesn't stop the behavior. It actually, in many ways, triggers the behavior. And again, not blaming, not shaming, just trying to understand it. So I think what needs to happen really at the get-go is setting some very clear boundaries, clearly defining what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So if you're going to drink, you have time when you don't have the children to drink. However, and I understand it's a problem and I understand you want to change it and I pray that you will. However, my only concern is the children. And so if we can make an agreement that when you're with the children, you will not drink and you won't drink the night before because you know how you wake up with a hangover, or you're not going to drink while they're with you, then this is your life and this is your problem. And I hope you will deal with it. That's a very different approach than you're a bad, terrible, horrible person. And I don't want you around our children and you're never going to change. And what's the person going to do? They're going to go like this and they're going to disappear, much like you suggested. And so, again, helping that other person to communicate what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what do they need, what will protect both parties and the children going forward. And creating that structure for them can lead to a better interaction and perhaps some understanding from that other person of what your client is most afraid of. However, they can't hear that when they're being admonished. They just can't.
Yeah, that's a good point. Once someone is being attacked, they're not open to hearing what are the underlying needs of this person who's attacking me.
And the other part is, I think we have to look at addiction not just as a chosen behavior. I think so often people who are involved with people who are addicted look at it as, if you cared about your children, you just stop. Or, if you wanted something different, you would just do better. I don't think it's as simple as that. I think addiction is a physiological illness, and yes, followed by behaviors. And there's a lot of things that need to be put in place in order to help this person. However, I think we really have to get to the core of it, and that involves therapy, and that involves support. And it may involve a 12-step program. It may involve, a smart recovery program, whatever suits the person. Or they may just have to start by agreeing to certain, again, boundaries and guidelines. But the beauty of it is, in our collaborative process, we have the opportunity, and even in any alternative dispute process, we have the opportunity to explore with these clients what might work best for your family. Where in a court, we know that a judge is going to say, do this, do this, do this, and do this, and we get noncompliance. Because when people are ordered to do things, they may go through the motions. However, they're not really invested. But if we talk to someone about what needs to be in place in order for them to do better and be better, then perhaps they feel like it's a safe container to explore those options. So I think being patient and compassionate is key. I think focusing on interests, not positions, like what's underlying this? What is really creating and triggering these issues? And how can we help this person to identify them and manage them in the most effective way? Again, not feeling shamed and blamed and guilty and defensive and non-responsive, because that's what happens.
Right. And, it's interesting to look at addiction as a coping mechanism, because I remember reading a book about eating disorders.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things the author said was that it's, everyone's doing the best they can.
Right.
And they just don't know how to cope with painful feelings. And it's like, you have a cut on your hand, you put ice cream on it instead of a Band-Aid. And I always liked that analogy.
I've never heard that, but I like it.
We all have stresses.
Yes.
We all have pain.
Yes.
Life is very challenging for everybody. And people who have gotten in a habit of turning to alcohol or drugs, they're feeling painful feelings, and they don't want to feel these painful feelings.
Exactly.
All of us react that way to painful feelings.
100%.
But some of us can meditate, can have figure out other more constructive, can write in their journal, can call their friend, call their cousin. I mean, there are other coping mechanisms that people who don't turn to substances have. And the truth is that those mind-altering substances are very effective at dulling the pain.
That's right. That's right. I share a story often about a woman I saw as a therapist. I was the family therapist, and she came in actually with her husband, and they had a 7-year-old son, and they were in a very conflicted marriage, and she was contemplating divorce. However, she was really, really afraid that the husband was going to get, at the time we used the term, I was in Florida at the time, we no longer use the term custody, we use timeshare, but she was really afraid that her husband was going to get full custody of her son because she had a kind of compromised past. And her past involved her being involved in a relationship where there was severe domestic violence. She actually was beaten by her ex-partner, and she lost a child in that. She was pregnant, and she lost her child. Later on, she met and married this other gentleman who seemed very mild-mannered. However, according to her, he wasn't physically abusive. However, he was emotionally abusive, utilized what had happened in her past to kind of manipulate her. And of course, this is her perspective. And so when she was beaten and lost her child, she began taking Oxy, like many people, for the pain. And there was more than physical pain, of course, losing a child to this situation. And so she continued to take the Oxy. And unbeknownst to her new husband, she was an addict and nobody knew. And when they began this kind of conflicted time in their relationship, she upped her dosages of her Oxy and she came to therapy. I had no idea she was using. She didn't tell anyone because she thought this would give her husband more grist for the mill to get her child. So she stayed in an unhealthy relationship, an abusive relationship, and she continued to take the drugs. The only time I found out was when she decided, she apparently passed out at some point, and she decided she needed help. And she packed her bags and she checked herself into a rehab, and she called me and she left a message telling me where she was because I was the only person who she trusted.
Oh,
And
my.
it was the first time in, I want to say I was seeing her for about a year, that she acknowledged to me that she had been using. And she told me that she was using because it was her way of coping with this new emotionally abusive relationship. And so she didn't know how to get out of it. She just didn't know how to get out of it. And she was so afraid she was going to lose her child. And so I think this is where we have to recognize that we have a wonderful opportunity to involve all kinds of professionals, such as therapists, addiction counselors, mediators, collaborators, to come together and brainstorm. How can we help this family? What can we do? And how can we break the cycle of addiction? Because to my mind, and trained as a family therapist, I truly believe that it's not just about one person. None of this happens in a vacuum. And we have to help the family to realize, how can we interrupt this cycle, put some guardrails in place, and help this whole family to heal in a better way.
So could you say more about that? I'm not sure I understand what you mean when you say that it's not happening. I mean, it's not happening in a vacuum, in that the sober spouse, let's say, is triggering the addicted spouse.
Well, you said it yourself. You said when she becomes aggressive, he becomes defensive, right?
Right,
So
right.
even just, and again, I'm not blaming her. He has the
Parent.
illness. However, she's a part of that. That's why Al-Anon exists, right? Partners of people who are addicted, because it's an interactional cycle. I do believe that. And we don't know, again, middle of the movie, we don't know chicken egg. However, what we do know is that they feed off of one another. And so, again, in an effort to interrupt the cycle, I think we have to understand the dynamic, which is where I come in when I'm working on a matter with you, all of you wonderful lawyers who really want to defend your client's position, but don't necessarily see the big picture right away, because of course you're only hearing this story from one client. And so it's really beneficial for me to come in and say, well, let's look at this whole family, and let's look at these dynamics, and let's see where we can put guardrails in place, put boundaries in place, and also look at, how does this occur? And when does this occur? And what can we do in a proactive way to perhaps prevent any damage from happening? And that's not an easy thing to do.
No, it's not.
And I think it requires us to stay solution oriented, right? Not, again, the blaming and shaming doesn't work.
Yeah.
What needs to be in place? It's my favorite question now. What needs to be in place in order for you to feel comfortable with the other person taking the children? What needs to be in place to feel assured that they're safe? It's no longer about changing that other person. That's what I love, really, about my work as a co-parenting therapist or a parenting coordinator, or even in the collaborative process, because now I say to them, it's no longer about changing that person to be the partner that you want. It's about helping that person to become the parent that you hope they will be for your child, because that's what's important, right? And it's not about preventing that so that you get full-time custody, if you will. It's about what needs to be in place for them to heal and have the best relationship that they can with your child and your child with them.
And from the children's perspective, they love both parents. They need both parents. They're going to do best if they can have time with both parents. So really, they do have joint goals.
Sure. Right. And for the child to know that a parent is doing whatever they can to create a good environment for them when they have them, how wonderful is that?
Yeah.
How wonderful is that for a child to really understand that this parent may have some challenges, may have some illness, may have some struggles, and they're working through it and they're doing whatever it takes. I can't imagine a child not growing up feeling honored by that their parent were willing to do whatever it takes to love them, to care for them, to be there for them, even in the midst of an illness. And
Right.
so, that's the message I want a child to have.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's very interesting because in my case, which I just keep going back to, the husband has tended to blame the wife for his relapses.
Mm-hmm.
And I was seeing that as him not accepting, well, I started drinking that time because you did X, Y, and Z. And that actually is his truth,
Right.
right?
Going to say that again, not an excuse, not a good excuse, but an
Right.
explanation. And I believe that's probably true.
But I reacted to it feeling like you're not taking responsibility for your own actions, which is going to the liquor store and buying some
Right.
liquor. And I think I'm wrong. I mean, maybe I'm wrong because he is being triggered because she is doing things that trigger him. I mean, she also, that's the piece that was missing from the conversation, is that she needs to understand what she's doing that is triggering.
And again, that doesn't mean that she is responsible for his addiction. However, as you say, he's responsible for his behaviors, right? So I said earlier, I do believe there's a physiological underlying cause of addiction. However, there is also a behavioral component. So when you're feeling triggered, you can do A, B, or C. You can, call mom. If you feel safe, you can call mom and say, this isn't a good day. I'm having a really bad day, and I don't think I should have the children today. Please don't, fault me for it. I'm getting help. If you could foster those kinds of conversations, that would be wonderful. Now, of course, these people, again, middle of the movie, they've been dealing with this for a long time, right? So you get your client who may be exhausted from this and doesn't want to be his caretaker anymore and doesn't also want to take his responsibility of having the children off of him, wants him to get better, right? So we have to create the context for that to happen. And we have to help the addicted person recognize that they have responsibility for functioning better and figuring out what to do and developing, as you say, more adaptive coping mechanisms. But again, what I'm saying is I think we as a team can find a way to provide those resources and have those conversations in a safe container, which of course wouldn't happen in a court and doesn't happen outside of our process either, because these people continue to do what they've always done. And again, blame and shame, and that doesn't work.
And you were telling me right before we started the podcast this morning, you were telling me about a case where the attorney in a non-collaborative traditional litigation model was looking at this as a winning-losing kind of thing, the custody, the schedule for the children, and didn't want the father to be recovering, to be sober, because then the mother would get more time with the children. And I just thought that's so crazy from the way that we as collaborative practitioners and mediators look at. I mean, we're looking at the family holistically and what's best for the children. I think, is going to be best for the parents. Like, why do people want to have children if they don't want to help them become their best selves? And children do best who are encouraged, allowed to have full and close relationships with both of their parents. So I feel like everyone who walks through the door of my office, that's what we all want.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, in the litigation system looks at it differently.
Sure.
And, and can frame scheduling the children as a win-lose proposition. And the attorneys and, the litigation attorneys are always like, win, win, win. And, there really are no winners.
That's right.
In that situation.
That's right. And they're not thinking about what's the win for the child, right? So going back to what I said earlier, a child knowing that their parent is doing whatever they can to be the best they can be so that they can share their time with them, to me, that is critical. And oftentimes, attorney litigators, they really don't see it that way. They see, I believe, that they are advocating for their client, typically one of the parents, who has a story, has a narrative about how this other person can never change, can never be okay, and that child will never be safe. And I do believe in many of these cases, the parent actually believes that because they've had an experience with this person, typically, where they've had many attempts at changing and they've relapsed. Relapse is a huge part of recovery.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, this other person is probably exhausted with the potential for change and doesn't believe that it can ever happen. However, an attorney aligning with that position really isn't thinking about a child and what we can do to help this person, again, be the best parent they can be, even if they don't resolve their addiction issues. However, they have boundaries around them when they're with their child. To me, that is key, right? So again, it's being able to have these conversations. It's being able to document agreements. Okay, when you have our child, this is what you're willing to do, and this is what you're agreeing to do, and this is what I'm counting on you to do. And that to me is where the attorney comes in, not saying, oh no, we're not going to put those safeguards in place because then you're not going to have your child full time. To me, that's not thinking about the child. That's thinking, as you say, Rachel, as an attorney, it's a win-lose situation. And the child always loses, always loses.
I like to say to my clients, my goal is that you won't have to look back at your behavior during this divorce process and wince. Like we're going to try to be fair to everybody and do what 5 years from now, you'll say, I tried as hard as I could. I did the best that I could.
I love that because I tell people all the time, you can't control the other person. What you can do is show up as your best self. And then you can look in the mirror and know you were your best self. So if we have, and I'm only using gender because I'm reflecting on your case. So if you have a woman who says, I'm fearful about where he goes and what he does, then to me, it's about how can you create a safe environment that he knows he can turn to you? And then she says, well, I don't want to protect him anymore. I don't want to help him anymore. And then you say, you're not protecting him. You're not helping him. You're helping your child. Is that something that you want to do? Is that something that you're interested in doing? And with compassion, I know this is hard. I know you've had enough. However, you had a child with this person, and this child has a right to have a relationship with their other parent. I think if we can build trust in our safe container, as I call it, if we can use empathetic listening and help them to have these kinds of conversations, I think that we can formulate an action plan for everyone to be better and everyone to do better. However, we're not going to do that in an aggressive, again, blaming and shaming environment. It's just not going to happen. The other thing is that I think my role as a therapist, wherever I'm placed in these matters, whether it's as a parenting coordinator or as a collaborative family specialist, I have to educate the other parent, the addicted parent, about the impact of their behavior on the entire system. So it's not just educating your client, the mom, about what she's doing and what she could be doing differently. It's about educating the dad about the impact. What happens when, you know, you take a child and the mother doesn't know where they are and she gets frightened and she gets upset and then she behaves in ways that you don't want. And then when she behaves in ways you don't want, then you behave in ways she doesn't want. And so helping them to understand this cycle. So doing a lot of what we call psychoeducation, helping them to understand the cycle of their behavior and how it impacts the entire system, including, of course, the children, is really, really important as well. And there are people, and you know this, through the pandemic and I started this podcast talking about all the crises that people are in nowadays. So there's many people out there who are addicted to substances and circumstances and don't believe they are, don't have any idea they are, and don't acknowledge that they are. So we have to start with educating them about that and things that they may not even realize. I heard recently something that I think was very apropos. So simple questions like asking a client, do you feel guilty when someone talks to you about your drinking? Do you get angry when somebody talks to you about your internet usage? Do you feel shame or guilt or self-doubt when somebody raises the idea that you may have an addiction problem? Those are probably some real good signs that there's an addiction problem, and helping them to figure it out and recognize how it may be interfering in their functioning can be useful, but none of that can happen in a unsafe environment. And that's why it's so important that we do this work.
Yeah, that's really such a great point. None of this can happen in an unsafe environment.
No. And helping everyone, as we do in the collaborative process, to focus on interests. What is most important to you here? And I use the question, what keeps you up at night? What are you most worried about, right? And then if you can have those kind of conversations, it's not about attacking the person. It becomes about attacking the problem. And then we can have a wonderful conversation about, okay, we have this problem. In family therapy, we have a theory, and it's a narrative approach to therapy. And we do something called externalizing the problem. So the problem becomes a problem outside of the person. And so that helps them not to feel ashamed and not to feel guilty. Okay, you have this addiction thing hanging out over here, and mom's afraid and dad's ashamed. What can we do with that? How can we deal with that outside of the person? You're not a terrible, awful, horrible father. However, this is a terrible problem. How can we attack that? To me, that's such a better approach.
Right. And that's one of the basic principles of interest-based negotiation is attack the problem, not the person.
Sure.
Because when you attack the person withdraws.
Of course.
Nobody wants to sit there and be attacked. So you end the conversation when you attack the person. You open up the conversation when you attack the problem.
As you know, that requires patience. It requires understanding. It requires compassion, which again, I think these people are so exhausted that we have to help them to kind of reestablish that.
Right, because they're in the middle of their movie.
That's right. That's right. They are in the middle of their movie.
Yeah. Well, this has been so helpful to have this conversation with you. I find myself thinking of the cases over the years that I've had. I mean, the other thing is how many high functioning addicts there are in this city, in this society, that people who have these secret addictions and they manage, they're very high performing, they never have a drink before 7 p.m. and they're like excellent at work. They're excellent in so many arenas, and yet they have this like tawdry secret that they're living with. It's just heartbreaking, really, and how alone they must feel. I think of people that I've seen over the years with presenting these challenges, where the father who drank to being, blacked out every night. So by 8 p.m. he's just like in the living room, and there were 7-year-old twins, and the mother didn't want him to have overnights because she said, what if one of them throws up at 10 o'clock and they can't wake you up? And then another case I had where the mother had gone to rehab twice, kept relapsing.
Mhm.
And the father came home one day and they had a 1.5-year-old child the mother was blacked out on the floor and had left something on the stove. And the 1.5-year-old was just crawling around the house trying to wake his mother and couldn't, just heartbreaking. And
Sure.
another case I had where the father put the kids to bed and then said, "Oh, the kids are in bed," and went out to a bar. And, the 6-year-old woke up and was looking for his father and called the mother, knew how to call the mother.
Mhm.
Um, and and that's how, this all came to light. And in that case, we were able to attack the problem.
Mhm.
And she said, "Look, if you're feeling that agitated feeling that you get and you need to drink, call me.
Exactly.
Wherever I am, I will come and pick up the kids." Like, just because they're scheduled to be with you Wednesday night, if you find that like you're having a hard Wednesday, let me know. I will cover for you. Like, these are our kids. We both want them to be safe. If you need to go out to the bar, just call me first.
That's exactly what I've been talking about. These conversations that they can have that are different than those typical conversations, the ones where they're slinging mud at each other. And to me, that is how you get the best result for your children, right? Because you want them to be safe. You want to know that they're in an environment where they're secure. And so if you can create that with their other parent, then you're doing them a service, you're giving them a gift. And again, you're not really doing it for the other parent, you're doing it for your child. And that's what's so important to remember. But that client that you just described is rare. And we, I think, as professionals, have to help people to come along to rise to that level of maturity and responsibility and accountability because they're doing the right thing for their child. And, someday their child will know, and someday their child will thank them, because
Right.
I do believe it all comes out in the wash, and someday their child will know that they were a supportive parent helping to encourage that relationship. Wherever that goes, it goes. However, if you're the one really helping, you can't be faulted. And that to me is so key. So
Right.
key.
Well, and also that partner was able to focus on the problem.
Sure.
But I guess also the partner is sometimes so worn down by the
Yeah.
history of the whole thing that it's very hard to trust and to find the way to get
Sure.
everybody focused on the problem, to acknowledge the pain and suffering on both
Correct.
sides.
Correct. And again,
Every human has that pain and suffering.
of course. And then again, if we can help that person to feel safe in acknowledging, I have a problem and I am going to do whatever I need to do. However, I can only do what I'm capable of doing at this moment in time. And so, again, putting those guardrails in place are some of the best things that we can do. I had a case way back many years ago with parents of two twin girls, and the dad had a substance abuse problem, and they were both, as you described, they were both very successful professionals in the community, and the girls were young and they were left in unsafe circumstances. However, in our family therapy, I did some educating even with the girls about addiction and how to help them to identify when they felt unsafe. And so much like you're saying, they were taught to use a cell phone. They were taught to be able to communicate with their mom. Dad was using SoberLink regularly and having hair follicle tests and ensuring that when he was with the girls, he wasn't using. And we worked together for about a year, and he had lost all of his parental rights, and they were returned to him because he was working wonderfully along with the mom and with the daughters. And they had, they were a little older as we moved through it. However, this was not easy. He was so dedicated, and it involved me working alongside with his addiction professional therapist and working with his ex-spouse and the children. So we took a whole systemic approach to helping him. And the girls couldn't have been happier when we finished the therapy.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah. I guess I had a case where the mother OD'd on heroin while she was driving
Oh my
with
goodness.
the kids in the car on the expressway. Luckily, a friend of hers was there who grabbed the wheel and was able to like steer the car off the highway. But the kid was obviously given full, custody to the dad. But then she went to rehab, and I had been the mediator in their divorce, which was before this all came out. And the family court judge actually called me into court to talk about what kind of schedule they should, to work with them. Like the judge, it was really a rare thing for me. The judge sat down with me and the couple, and we were able to brainstorm a new schedule. The mother had gone to rehab and was doing everything that she could do to make sure the kid was safe.
And isn't that wonderful for a child to grow up knowing that their parent did everything possible to make sure they were safe? There's a myth out there that an addict, they only care about themselves. They don't care about their loved ones. There's assumptions that they're selfish and self-involved. All of that may appear to be true. However, if we look at it with compassion, we can understand that there's something underneath it. There's something underneath it that didn't begin now. And so
Right.
how do we help them to understand that, to get better, and to do better? That to
And
me is our
how can we
goal.
teach them that they can put a Band-Aid on a cut? They don't have to put
I
alcohol in.
love that. Right. And that their addiction is not a sign of weakness, that it's not a moral failure. It's not out of a lack of caring again. It's about something that you're struggling with, and how can we help them to realize that they can get help and they can do better, and that recovery is not a straight path, right? It's not okay, I'm going to get better and here I go. It's a long path. And listen, going through a divorce and having an addiction problem, to me, would make you want to drink more, right? So, or make you want to use whatever that substance is or that circumstance is that alleviates your stress. So if we can help them to have those components in place as they're going through the process, we have so much more potential. They
Yeah.
have so much more potential.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your insights.
Oh,
This has been
thank you.
a fantastic conversation.
I love talking with you. It always is.
I'm also thinking about this whole pattern of addiction so many humans fall into, and probably they were young and immature when they began to develop these patterns. It's a coping mechanism. Like a 14-year-old's not going to come up with the best ideas to cope with very, very serious problems that maybe are facing them. And, that's where these patterns start.
And I would suggest that if we were to do some kind of a research study, which I love to do, we'd find that a lot of these behaviors started in children whose parents were divorcing.
Right. That's right.
Because they came out of high conflict situations. And in order to soothe the angst, they did something to help them to cope.
Many parents themselves are in crisis while they're going through divorce and transition, and they're terrified.
That's right.
And they're distracted from focusing on their kids by their own pain and their own struggles and negotiations and fears. And then the kids don't have that support from the parents, and they're trying to cope with their own lives. And here we go.
Exactly. And again, that's where we have such an opportunity to provide a safe container for these families.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm
Well,
grateful.
that's why we have some very satisfied clients who say, thank goodness I had you to help me through this difficult time.
That's right.
Right. Well, Randy, I could talk to you for hours.
Me too.
So thank you so much for all your insights today. I guess maybe we can come up with a couple of takeaways.
Establish clear communication about what the problem is. Again, what's keeping you up at night? What are you worried about? What needs to be in place in order for you to feel better about this? Whatever it is. I think also dispelling some of those myths. You're not doing this because you want to. You're not doing this because you're weak or immoral. You're doing this because you have a problem. So let's figure out what's the solution to the problem. Establishing clear boundaries around when you can have the children and when you cannot have the children, if there is a concern. And then softly and gently encouraging some support, some help, some exploration as I or any mental health professional provides some psychoeducation around what does addiction really look like? What does it mean? And how can we prevent it from interfering in a child's well-being, right? Because that's really what we're looking at. And then ultimately your own well-being. However, to me, the first priority is a child who doesn't have that protection. And so those are some of the takeaways I would suggest.
Yeah. And I guess one other takeaway that I got from our conversation is it's really, family dynamics really are a system.
Yes.
And when there's an addicted person, the other person probably is doing things that make it harder for them to have honest communication.
Yes.
And when we focus on the children, like you said, very concrete, what are the things you need to protect your child from? Then it can come up with like a new path, a new way to talk about the whole.
Sure, because in their relationship prior to deciding to divorce, it was probably you're bad, no, I'm not. You're bad, no, I'm not. And so if we can change that conversation, I think, as you say, we can change the path.
Yes, that's great. Change the conversation and change the path. I love that. All right,
Thank
Randy.
you so much. It was a pleasure.
Pleasure talking to you as always, and I hope to see you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, bye. Take care.